Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this Tuesday Scholar event. Our speaker today is Alfred Marcus, who will address the topic, When a Nation Grows Old, the Implications of Global Demographics. Alfred Marcus is the Edson Spencer Professor of Strategy and Technology Leadership at the Carlson School of Management, the University of Minnesota. His latest book is Demography and the Global Business Environment. Today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota with the financial support of the Friends of the Ramsey County Libraries. We are deeply grateful to both these organizations. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn things over to our speaker, Alfred Marcus, on the topic, When a Nation Grows Old, the Implications of Global Demographics. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to be with you. Thank you for sharing this pleasant day with me. I know it's really nice in Minnesota today. The weather is great. So I'm going to roll back my slides to the beginning. And this topic for this book originated to a large extent out of a piece that I wrote with my co-author, Mazhar Islam. Mazhar we used to be a PhD student of mine. Now he is a student in his own right. And we were particularly interested in the topic of youthfulness in societies, with proportionately large number of young people in society, and the relationship between proportionately large numbers of young people in societies and in nations and in their propensity towards war and violence, which is a well-known phenomenon. And we were interested in whether, as these countries had a decline in the number of young in proportion to their total population, whether their propensity for violence would go down. This has a lot to do with Mazhar's own personal history. He was, during the civil war between Bangladesh and Pakistan, his mother was killed, and he was in her arms. He was 6 months old. He was only discovered 6 months later. But we became very interested in this topic of demography. And if you want to explore issues having to do with youthful societies, I recommend the book, and you can take a look at that as well. But today I'm going to focus on societies that grow old. And this also reflects some of the teaching that I've done in this area about and some of the research that we're doing right now on the extent to which elderly societies have entrepreneurial opportunities. What are the business opportunities in societies that are aging? So what I'm going to cover today is I'm going to do a slight introduction, and then I'm going to talk about the issue of old versus young people in the United States, focusing on the growing proportion of people in the United States who are older. And then I'm going to talk about this phenomenon in other countries. I'll delve further into the book, getting deeper into the book, and then I welcome your questions and discussions. I think this phenomena of demography is critical for our understanding what is happening in the world. There was a certain point in time when I actually felt that demography is destiny, and you could explain everything by looking at the age composition of a nation or a society. There are many, many moderating and mediating factors that go against this particular trend of thought that I have. One example would be, I would have never thought that both Russia and the Ukraine, which are societies that are aging, could sustain a war for as long as they have sustained it. But we have seen how difficult it has been for Russia to mobilize people to actually fight in the war. So that would be an example of this phenomenon playing out on a global stage. I'm going to talk a little bit more how it plays out on a global stage as well. So my own interest in the topic, where it came from, I'm going to go back to this. For most of my life, I was born in 1950, so I'm in the aging category. For most of my life, and I think the accepted conventional wisdom, which I accepted as well, was that we faced overpopulation in the world, and that there were too many people, and that this would create enormous strain on the resources of the world, and we wouldn't be able to sustain it for a long period of time, that it created environmental problems, and that the most important thing that we had to do was to control the number of people that were in the world. It's something that the Chinese did quite effectively with their one child per family policies. And then I heard a talk by, this is maybe 15 years ago, by an individual named Paul Longman. The book was called The Empty Cradle. And these are some of the slides from the talk that he gave. And it alerted me to a whole other phenomena that I had not really considered or thought of a great deal. So if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see that, at least during my lifetime, as I said, during my lifetime, I was born in 1950. The world population when I was born was about 2.4 billion. And today, I mean, this is the year 2000, but if we today, it's about 8 billion people. So we're about 4 times as many people in the world as when I was born. There's probably as many people in the world today as there have been throughout history. If you want to think about that, it's an incredible way of thinking about it. And even if we look at the first, and if you compare the first 50 years of the 20th century to the last 50 years of the 20th century, the first 50 years were a period of struggle in terms of growth in the world's population. And we all know some of the reasons why: economic conditions, the Great Depression, and the world wars that occurred during that period of time. We've had a period of relative peace, we've had advances in science, and we've had growing numbers of people living longer, which is a big part of the reason why we have so many more people in the world. Then if you look at the left-hand side, which is a projection that is done by the United Nations, and we go, the world population is supposed to peak, and this is just a trend line, and it's based on how many babies each woman on average has, which is declining throughout the world. So if you look at the trend line, the world's population will continue to increase till about the year 2050, 2060. It will peak. I would say today, people say it's going to peak more closer to 9 billion than what is shown on this chart, 9 to 10 billion. But then afterwards, because there will be a decline in the number of babies per woman, which has been happening for quite a long time. If we go out to the year 2300, I'm sure none of us will be alive by that point in time. But by 2300, this is if trends continue. If trends continue, there's so many factors that can intervene. But if we just took a straight trend line and we assumed that the trend of women having fewer babies throughout the world will continue, we will be back to about the same number of people in the year 2300 as in the world as there were in the year 1900. So the trend line will plateau, peak, and begin to decline. And this is the book that alerted me, and I met Phil. He spoke at the University of Minnesota. I brought him out. It was in the first decade of the 21st century. His book was called The Empty Cradle. And even at that time, it was quite noticeable that the replacement fertility, which is 2.1 children per woman in most of the advanced countries in the world, including Japan and Germany, was below replacement level. In the United States, when this chart was done, which was in the first decade of the 20th century, the United States actually had a replacement level which was would have created a stable population within the United States going forward. A lot of this had to do with immigration into the United States. A lot of it has to do with the fact that immigrants tended to have more children than people who were born in the United States, and they were able to lift the level in the United States. So it was actually a quite healthy level. And so what was happening though throughout the world was people were living longer. So the proportion of the people in the world who were older was growing and would continue to grow, and the number of people, because women were having fewer babies, would continue to decline. And that has all kinds of important implications for the economy. Most people, when they set up families and have families, they buy homes, they buy appliances, they do a lot of spending, which spurs economic growth. The workforce is increased, and when the workforce increases, that also spurs economic growth. So there are a lot of economic implications of aging as well. And so in the United States, that's sort of the motivation for my interest in this area, both the issue of violence in countries that are disproportionately young, and that still persists in the world. If you look at nations where you have the most violence, such at least in our recent history, such as Afghanistan, Iraq, you look at Palestinian territories, you look at Nigeria. These are very, very young societies, completely different age composition than the age composition we see in the United States. So what this shows, so the earlier chart showed that the United States had a kind of stable situation where the average woman actually was having about 2.1 babies. So this changed in about the year 2007, 2008. After that other chart was produced. And today, the United States also, the number of babies per woman has gone down below replacement level, and we're in the same category of these other aging societies, perhaps not as bad as some of them. If you look at some of these societies, if you look at Taiwan, Spain, Japan, etc., it's really very, very exceptionally low. Italy is another country that is exceptionally low. These countries are aware of this problem, and each one of them has had different kinds of policies that are associated, pro-natalist policies, which are associated with the country, which they're trying to reverse these trends, because in the long run, it can be very, very problematic. So I want to point out at the outset one major factor that is affecting our economy today. I know we're all experiencing inflation levels that are exceptionally high compared to the last decade or so in the United States. And a very, very important reason for that, which does not get enough attention. If you read the newspapers about the causes of inflation, people talk about wage pressure. So where does wage pressure come from? Wage pressure comes from the fact that there's an unprecedented situation today in the United States that has never existed before in my lifetime, and which came into existence before COVID. It was part of a trend. So for my entire lifetime, we've been very concerned about unemployment, and unemployment is driven by the fact that there are fewer jobs than there are workers seeking jobs. In other words, the jobs are scarce, and the number of workers is very, very high in proportion to the number of jobs that exist. That situation has been reversed. It started becoming reversed right before COVID. It started becoming reversed in the 2018-2019 period, and now there's a record number of job openings for every U.S. unemployed person. I think that there's something like 1.8 jobs for each person seeking a job, which means that we have a sticky point in our capacity to bring down inflation. So no matter what the Federal Reserve does in terms of raising interest rates, it can't really deal with this. This is a structural factor that's built into our economy. And I think it's very, very fundamental and very, very important. And it also brings up the question of, are there enough young workers to take care of the increasing needs of the elderly? So in any society, there's a statistic that's gathered, which we call the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is the number of people who are fully employed in comparison to those who are too young and too old to take care of themselves. And of course, in our society, the dependency ratio is driven by aging rather than by having a large number of young people. And this has economic implications. So this was already occurring, and this is growth in the number of people who are employed. So it's growth in the number of people who are employed. It means it's still more people are entering the workforce in major emerging economies in China and India. But in the United States, there's actually a decline in the number of people. It's a negative figure, the number of people who are entering the workforce. It's Japan, definitely the case. It's been that way for a long time, and it's also happening in Europe. So the implications, what are the implications of this? I was looking at, in this particular chart, the period between the 10-year period between 1997 and 2006, and then I took the 5-year period after that. And in each of these countries, there was a decline in the growth of the workplace and the number of workers entering the workforce in comparison to previous period. And as this happens, labor productivity was also falling in all of these countries. So why would labor productivity fall? When you have fewer people in the workforce, you have less innovation, you have less vitality, less creativity, you have more of a inertia in the economy. Young people, when they enter the economy, introduce new ways of doing things, and there's also pressure because for these people, because there are many of them, and as we said before, there are few job openings. So this all leads to growth in labor productivity. And right now in the United States, the most alarming thing about our high inflation levels are that we have not had an increase in productivity. Our productivity growth is basically zero. So if we had productivity growth at the same time with high inflation, it would not be so much of a problem. So there are also opportunities. I've so far stressed some of the problems associated with aging, but there are also a number of positives that are associated with aging, or at least aging provides an opportunity. It's a lucrative market. And so people generally who are older, their median income tends to go down. These statistics are a little bit old, but I think the important thing to look at here is the proportions. And as a person gets older, they reach their highest earning capacity. This is in terms of income, but we all know that income isn't the only way to look at earning of spending potential. And so but as people get older, 65 and older, their net worth increases because they've accumulated savings over time. So we have this phenomena of, even though people's income is going down, their net worth is going up, which should provide opportunities for businesses and for entrepreneurs to serve people under these conditions. But the composition of the kind of spending that is done is quite different. So if you look at the average person, I just want to, on these slides, if you look at on the part of the slide to the very far left, if you look how the average person spends their money, they spend about 8.1%. The average family, the average household spends about 8.1% on healthcare. But as people age, there's naturally this occurs. They spend much more on healthcare. The healthcare is the biggest part of the U.S. economy currently. It's something like 8% of GDP. It totally dwarfs our spending on defense and on any other area of our economy. And healthcare goes up. People between 65 and 74 are spending 11% of their total spending on healthcare. And as they become even older and they become over 75 years old, they spend as much as 16% on healthcare. So that should open up opportunities, business opportunities, maybe not in a macro sense. I think it tends, in a macro sense, aging tends to lead to declines in GDP growth. And many economists have talked about a secular decline in GDP growth in the United States. So that the best we can expect under the best circumstances is GDP growth of, let's say, 3%. But we're not going to reach that. We're going to lose, let's say, 0.5% of our GDP just because of aging. But the composition of GDP is going to change, and it has been changing more towards healthcare as opposed to these other categories. So housing would be an example. Like when somebody's younger families spend more on housing. I guess that's not true, but we're actually looking at these charts. But the categories of spending change quite a bit over time. And the other aspect that leads to elderly people spending more is that they're spending, even if their consumption expenditures go down, they're supplemented by subsidies from the government, which are meant to be spent on healthcare. So as people 75 years and older, Medicare, Medicaid, and other supplementary forms of healthcare. We do have in the United States national health insurance system, but it's for people who are older, but not for the population as a whole. So that sustains the amount of spending that takes place among older people, even though their incomes decline. So it's both their savings over time, their net worth plus subsidies. Another interesting, this is just a interesting factor about how the spending of older people, it tends to go up for vacations. As long as old people are healthy, they have the time, and they spend a lot of time. Apparently, I'm getting all these advertisements for cruises and other recreational activities of that nature. So there are entrepreneurial opportunities addressing the needs of the elderly. Some of our research right now has been focusing on this relationship between changes in demography and entrepreneurial opportunities. And so, for example, for entrepreneurs, aging, something like Alzheimer's is not a disease, but it's a business opportunity. The major pharmaceutical companies have been desperately trying to develop Alzheimer's drugs that are effective and that are affordable. Mostly they have failed. There are some that have been approved. We all know about the approval of these drugs. These drugs have a lot of side effects, and their effectiveness is still questionable, and their approval, and they cost a huge amounts. And it's unclear whether health insurance is really going to actually pay for them, and they have to be administered at an early age, an early enough age so that they actually could be effective. But it's not just the Alzheimer's drugs, but there are so many disorders from which we inevitably, in one way or another, are going to suffer from as we age, unfortunately. These diseases are opportunities for the large drug companies and for small drug companies, for entrepreneurs. I can mention all of them, but they're up there on the slide. And then there are other aspects of the healthcare system where innovation is possible, such as telemedicine, home health monitoring, home health care. There's even like auto safety. If you've bought a vehicle recently, you can see that there are a number of features in your vehicle which did not exist previously. And many of these have been introduced because of the awareness of the automobile companies that a higher proportion of the people who are going to be driving are people who are older, and some of their sensory perceptions are going to be impaired to some degree, and they're going to need more warning systems in their car to increase automotive safety. So you can really extend this to the entire society and think about various entrepreneurial opportunities that become open to once a population ages and the population has money to spend, and the money to spend that there is going to be focused around healthcare issues. And Japan has faced this problem for a very, very long time. They've healthcare, a shortage of caregivers for older people. And this also has created opportunities in Japan. The Japanese have responded by creating these care bots to assist elderly people. Basically, what that is there are robots that will see that friendly little bear, the robot in the picture, and he can lift a person, but he can also chat with the person, an elderly person, and keep the elderly person company, which is isolation is another big issue that older people face. And this market, can be almost infinite at some point in time. If you I'm going to share my slides afterwards, and if you want to look at, there's a blog that explains more about how these care boats work and the robots may work. So that's so far what I wanted to speak about. I wanted to speak about aging, particularly in the United States, and the trends in aging, and in addition, I wanted to speak about what the impacts on the economy and the business opportunities that are opened up by aging, a different type of business opportunities. If we were talking about a younger population, we would be talking about business opportunities, let's say in education. We would be talking about business opportunities in gaming. It would be a completely different set of opportunities that then exists in an aging society. So I'm going to now provide you with a deeper dive into some of what was in the book, and focus more on the rest of the world and give you some trends that exist in the rest of the world. So the way we organized the book, we did a deep dive into these. I think there are 12 or so countries that we looked at quite intensively. And if you can see here, this is the median age in selected countries. In Japan, the median age, these numbers would come from about 2020. So that, you can find all of these numbers on the internet. There are many, many sources on the internet. A lot of them come from the United Nations, the World Bank. But if you can see that this is the average among the aging populations. The median age is above 40. Japan is the highest in the world, and Germany is slightly behind. This is not every country in the world. These are the ones that we looked at intensively. We looked at these countries, Japan through China, as aging societies. Then we looked at societies that or nations that were middle-aged. That includes everything from Brazil to Iran. These countries, the average of the middle-aged countries as opposed to the elderly countries was about 30 years old, as opposed to the aging was over 40. And then we looked at young countries, which I'm not going to talk about much here, which I've already mentioned, where you see disproportionate amounts of violence. In these countries, the average age was something like 20. So you have to imagine a world that exists today where countries are really basically different in their composition. There are some countries in the world which are predominantly young, some countries in the world which are predominantly old, and some countries in the world that are in the middle. And our premise in this book was that they had different overall characteristics. Their politics were different, their propensity towards violence was different, their economies were different. And so these were the countries we looked at intensively, and I'm going to give you some overview on the aging side. I don't have enough time to talk about the younger countries as much. So if we look at growth in life expectancy, I wanted to start with the Asian countries because typically I think people understand that Japan is the oldest median age of any country in the world, but I think people don't think a lot about these so-called Asian tigers whose population, whose economies have taken off and are have become very, very important players in the world economy. So countries like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. And so why have they been aging? And aging is always a combination of these two factors. And I want to focus particularly actually on Taiwan, because Taiwan has become the soft spot in the world, or the place where a world war could actually begin. And I think that the aging of its population actually has a role to play in this problem in a particular way. So as these countries developed, their economies developed, their life expectancy went way up. This is life expectancy. Their life expectancy in these countries actually is higher than our life expectancy right now. Our life expectancy has fallen in the COVID period, which is very, very sad. And most of these countries today have better life expectancy than we have in the United States. And so part of their aging is a function of the fact that people are living longer. And the other factor is that their fertility rates are going down. So remember I said 2.1 babies per woman is a stable fertility rate. And all of these countries have fertility rates that are much lower than 2.1%. They're actually, if you observe it, the fertility rates in these countries are quite low, as low as 1.2 babies per woman. There have been some increases. There have been efforts been made. Part of the problem exists in these countries is that as women become more educated, they marry later, and they become very picky about who they want to marry, and there aren't enough educated men of sufficient quality for them to marry. A number of these countries have actually created, their governments have created dating services to stop this trend, had social events. They recognize that it is a problem and it's not sustainable in the long run, and that their economic vitality and prosperity is threatened by this decline. Now, I think it's particularly important with regard to Taiwan, because Taiwan is at the center of the dispute between the United States and China. And in particular, there's a company called TSMC, which makes the most advanced chips in the world. So if you think about companies that such as Apple, NVIDIA, AMD, who are making and manufacturing the most advanced chips in the world, they don't manufacture, they design the chips. And on almost all these chips, tiny chips, and the capability of making them, and these chips are in everything from our refrigerators to our guided missiles. They were originally developed for our weapons program, so they're central to our security. the TSMC, which is the major manufacturer of these chips, according to a recent article that was in the Wall Street Journal, is facing a shortage of skilled young workers. And whether TSMC can sustain its predominance in chip making is a question. We want to bring a lot more of this back to the United States, and that's what the Biden administration has been attempting to do. The question is, do we have the human power to manufacture these chips? There was, I think, even a few days ago, an article on the wall. I think it was in the New York Times. Actually, I think it was in yesterday's New York Times, that even though we're building these plants in Ohio, we don't have the capability of actually we don't have the human resources to man or to work in these plants. So it's at a central point, a break point in the world, and it has, I think, a lot to do with this issue. So and you can see what happens. So here is a chart with birth rates and death rates in Japan. And you can see that Japan had higher birth rates and death rates till about 2003, 2004, when more people were dying than were actually being born. Japan is really amazingly interesting in this regard, because if we go back to the period before the Second World War, the Japanese population was among the youngest in the world, which conforms to my theory that, and it's not just my theory, but the theory that disproportionately young populations are exceptionally aggressive, and they're more prone to war and violence of all kinds, civil wars, all kinds of war and violence than other societies. But Japan, I think, in most of our eyes, is one of the most pacific societies today, and some of that can be explained by the fact that it's a very, very old society, and it has had repercussions. So these are correlations at best, but if you look at this slide, and you can see that for a good proportion, when Japan had a younger population, it was, and we all know that the Japanese miracle came to an end in about 1992. So Japan, in the period of the 1960s, there was still a large influx of young people into their population, and Japan was taking off like crazy compared to the rest of the world's GDP growth. Japan was on top of it. We were worried in the 1980s that if trends continued, Japan would be the richest country in terms of total GDP in the world by today, certainly by today. But all of a sudden, their economy crashed in about 1992. There were a lot of other things that are associated with it. It's never really come back. There's been very little growth. But one major factor was the demographic factor, the factor that it aged. So started aging. There were more deaths in the population than births in the population. Now, Japan is quite different than the United States because there's no immigration, and that's a big part of this story. Immigration is critical to alleviating this problem. There are really only two ways of alleviating the problem, as far as I can ascertain. And one is that immigration is critical, and the second thing that's critical is that technological progress. And you have to get your economy more productive, or you have to have more workers in your economy for it to sustain its level of prosperity. And Japan is very innovative from a technological perspective. I was showing you that before, the use of robotics to help care for the elderly. But Japan is a very closed society, very few immigrants. So it's very hard for them to replenish the number of people that they have. Japan actually has been doing a little bit better recently. So maybe it's the productivity has increased because of technology. Maybe these things sort themselves out in the long run. But I wanted to compare Japan to Germany. So Germany, the death rate in Germany, if you look at this chart, the death rate is actually, the death rate has been greater than the birth rate in Germany. This is the death rate for, and the orange line is the death rate, and the blue line is the birth rate. And the death rate for Germany has been greater than the birth rate for since the 1980s. Now, we all know that Germany, their growth in GDP hasn't been fantastic, but they've certainly done better than the Japanese. So what explains this? And Germany also is a very, very old society. So I think this is supportive of my argument of the importance of immigration. And this is something I didn't know when I started this book, and I learned that what has happened in Germany, there has been enormous pushback in terms of social stability, but Germany has actually accepted many, many people via immigration. It is, and this immigration has actually replenished the population, where they have actually had a growing population, especially in the second decade of the 21st century. And it's been very, very important to Germany. And in fact, I did this comparison in terms of net. This isn't total immigration. The United States still leads in terms of total immigration. But if you look at net immigration per thousand population, you have other countries compared, and you look at it during these different time periods, you can see that if you look at it in terms of proportion of the population, it's gone up in Germany, and it's actually greater than the US. Russia actually has absorbed a lot of people from Asia, which is, I think, something that's not well known. Spain has been has had huge numbers of people leaving in comparison to those coming. In Japan, not very many. And China, again, is a country with little immigration. I mean, it's a closed society. China does have one element that I think is important, though, to be aware of. There's been an enormous movement in China from people living in rural areas to the big cities. It's actually very hard in China to move from the rural areas to the big cities. You have to. It's not like in the United States, although even in the United States, you move from one state to another. There's all kinds of hassles that you have to endure, like you have to get a new driver's license and your insurance changes and so on. But in China, you have to be accepted. If you're going to move to Beijing from the countryside, you have to be accepted, and it's a process that's almost like immigration. But in any case, I think the important thing to be aware of here is that Germany has been a country that has replenished its population through immigration, and that is reflective of the GDP growth rates in Germany versus Japan. So if you look at the earlier period here, both countries are suffering from this. Well, this is the 2000-2008 Great Recession that we had throughout the world, and both countries GDP fell off. But through most of this period, Germany has had higher growth rates per year than than Japan. And I think a big reason for that is that Germany has had a large number of immigrants. So if you think about the following, who developed one of the most important COVID therapies, the treatment for COVID, that we all have experienced recently. It was two Turkish immigrants to Germany. And if you look at the United States today, the United States, so many of the leadership positions in the United States are held today by first and second generation or foreign-born people. We benefit tremendously from the immigrants who come into our country. And I'm not going to do a further plea politically. I mean, there are humanitarian reasons as well, but from a purely self-serving, self-interest perspective, that's the premise of the United States. And it's very, very critical for our own self-interest that we have lots of immigrants. So that's where I wanted to go with this. And I don't know if I'm open for questions. I don't know if I've exceeded or how I'm doing with time. How am I doing with timing?
You're doing very well. It's just about quarter after the hour, so we have until 2 o'clock our time. We've got 45 minutes for questions, and we already have a few questions in the Q&A line, but there's room for plenty more. So I will say to the audience, this is your chance now. If you have a question on any of these topics, you can ask your question. I'm going to give myself the award of asking the first question. One of the things that immediately occurred to me when you spoke about, for example, Germany and doing better because immigration has
Right.
provided the necessary boost to population, and I think also of our immigration situation. It seems that when you're in the moment, immigration creates, huge problems, and maybe the benefits are not as well expressed. And I'm thinking that the rise of immigration in Germany, for example, seems to coincide exactly with the resurgence of right-wing German political movements, the Alternative für Deutschland, that kind of thing, which is, given the context of world history, that's scary. And I apologize for my cell phone that just went off in the background. I'll take care of that while you answer the question.
No, I mean, I think that that's absolutely true, that there's a backlash in the United States and elsewhere, and immigration has to be managed. And I think that our country still has a huge pull and attraction for immigrants, for talented immigrants. And I know that sounds somewhat cruel, but I think we also have to screen immigrants. It's not that we can accept all people. But I think if it's managed carefully, it's hard to manage carefully. And we all know that we have a backlash politically in the United States based on that whole factor. And it has to be explained. I think that those values have to be affirmed by our politicians and even the composition of our society. We are not a nation state. And we are a state of many different ethnic groups and peoples. And that's that. And we've not always been as open as we are now. Had we not, in the 1965 under the Johnson administration, our laws with regard to immigration were changed fundamentally. Before that, from 1924 to 1965, ironically, in place was a law called the Johnson Act, which restricted immigration to the United States based on the proportion of the ethnic composition as it was in 1890, which excluded basically, and we people from China were entirely excluded even before that. They were not allowed to immigrate to the United States. There were exceptional circumstances, and that was back in the 19th century. So we've opened ourselves up to Hispanic immigration, and we've opened ourselves up to Asian immigration, and we've been enriched by it. Had that not happened, I think we would be a far poorer country. But I don't think this is widely understood, and I think it should be. This message needs to be spread, but there is a populist backlash against it. It's occurred throughout the world, and the politics are quite ugly as a consequence. And that's undeniable, and it has to be managed well. And that's the other part of it.
It seems though that we're doing such a poor sales job as a society of stressing what you've mentioned in this talk, the benefits to the aging population of immigration. All we really hear about is, immigrants are coming for our jobs, low-skilled jobs, low-skilled immigrants, but the demographic benefits to an aging population of immigrant, Social Security workers, never seems to be mentioned.
Those low-skilled jobs also are very, very valuable, and they do very essential jobs the industrial heartland, which has been hollowed out in the United States, in my view, is not a consequence of immigration. That we've lost those manufacturing jobs because large corporations have been searching out lower cost labor, and that's mostly has been in China. And those two phenomena are different phenomena.
Okay. All right. Well, let's turn to the questions, of which there are several now.
Yeah.
What was the impact on Social Security of COVID? How did it impact it? I mean, people died, more people died, but more people left the workforce. What was the net impact of COVID?
That's a difficult one.
From a demographic point of view, that is.
Yeah, from a demographic point of view, well, COVID definitely was a disease, which also was not emphasized as much, was a disease of the elderly, as we all know. The highest proportion of people who died were older people. And in some ways, the restrictions on society as a whole was done in great kindness to elderly people. I don't have good numbers on this. I mean, when you mention Social Security right now, I just think about the fact that should we have the budget deficit, the budget negotiations break down, one of the first things that might occur would be that the Social Security payments would stop, at least temporarily, which would be a big problem in general. So yeah, I don't know where to take that one next.
All right, well, we'll move on here. How will technology advancement factor into the need for new workers? Will necessary workers needed be more in historically low-paying jobs? If we're going to advance technologically, what happens to our need for workers?
Well, I mean, there are two fundamental trends, two ways of dealing with aging, in my view. And these are very broad categories. The one category would be immigration, where we refresh our workforce, both at the bottom and at the top. It's exceptional how many. If you being at a university for a long period of time, if I look at our PhD programs, if I look at, especially in science, technology, in the areas which are most important for improving our productivity and making advances in technology, these programs are heavily dominated by recent immigrants, first-generation Americans. And they're critical to our sustaining our country, because we're drawing. I mean, if you think about it for a minute, the capabilities of our K through 12 educational system, it's a troubled system, and we're actually drawing from we're using the extremely competitive educational systems that exist throughout the world and drawing the best and the brightest to our higher education. And during as the Trump administration, I don't want to get too political here, but the Trump administration started making it less friendly for immigrants and actually imposed restrictions. It became much more difficult for us in the United States, at the University of Minnesota in particular, to attract people from abroad to fill places in our MBA programs, our PhD programs. Many of them were going, there were a lot of options. Canadian business schools were flourishing like they never had previously. Yeah. So I'm not sure where this question started, but I think that I think by being anti-immigration, what we're doing is like cutting off one of our legs. It's so severe in terms, and again, I'm not saying it doesn't have to be managed, and it has to be, because if it's unmanaged, then the political backlash is worse, and it's not clear how to manage it, precisely, because but most people who come to the United States from abroad are extraordinarily ambitious as well. And,
Mhm.
you know, everybody is actually came to the United States at some point in time. We just, how many generations back, and that drive of those first generations
Mhm.
are just extraordinary. I mean, you can take just parts of the Twin Cities and see how they've been, the Renaissance that has occurred with like on parts of Lake Street, Hispanic businesses and so on.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
the contributions that immigrants make is just very, very important to our country. But again, we've said this before, it has to be messaged appropriately, and it hasn't been messaged appropriately. What we get is these pictures of masses of people, many of them. If you think about what if you're coming from Guatemala and you've walked, to the border
Yeah.
to try to get in the United States, out of
Mhm.
desperation, if you are welcomed into the United States, your life is not going to be easy, but you're going to
Mhm.
really exert exceptional energies
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
advance yourself.
Mhm.
That drive is important.
Right. Okay. All right. How will immigration and population movement across the world impact population age groups in the countries that you studied? And I'm not quite sure the focus of this question, but maybe I'm going to ask, if population is declining everywhere, if the birth rate is declining
Yes.
everywhere, are there still going to be these reservoirs of potential immigrants who want to come to the West?
Yeah, I mean, so what you have, like, if I would have it, I have it in the book, but if you would see like a country like
Uh-huh.
Egypt or Saudi Arabia,
Mhm.
if you go back 15 years or 20 years, the average woman was having 6 to 7 children.
Yeah.
Today,
Yeah.
she's having 3 to 4 children. So
Mhm.
it's still a lot larger than than
Mhm.
and of course, another part of this can be pro natalist policies in the United States. We need better childcare. The Scandinavian countries have done quite well with providing childcare, and they've brought up their birth rates quite a bit.
Mhm.
So it can
Mhm.
be reversed. I mean, we are not Scandinavia as much as we admire them,
Yeah.
but
Uh-huh.
it can be reversed. But I think you know, it, throughout the world right now, there is an overabundance of young people in some countries, and these people, the outlet, if they're moving, they want to move in
Mhm.
the we but it's a very complicated question about if we can do it
Mhm.
smoothly without the political backlash is incredibly dangerous. So
Yeah.
I don't want to minimize that.
Yeah. On that subject of overpopulation, oversupply of young people, I think I just read yesterday, probably in the New York Times, that 1 out of 5, despite China's successful
Right.
efforts to control its population, 1 out of 5 young people in China is out of work, doesn't have a job.
Yes.
Well, what is the safety valve for that population? Are they allowed to immigrate in search of, and should they be allowed to immigrate? Would that be a good thing for the world if they were allowed to immigrate?
Well, I mean, I think that's certainly true. I think what's kind of interesting about China is that China has realized that they have this problem of huge proportions on their hands, and they've
Mhm.
eliminated the one child per couple
Mhm.
policies that were in place for so many years. And I think this is true generally throughout Asia, that they've recognized this, but it hasn't changed even when they eliminated it, because it
Yeah.
becomes part of the culture. Part of the issue is it's very, very expensive. If you're living in a big city in China,
Mhm.
it's very expensive. Even in the United States, it's very expensive to have a child. The
Mhm.
typical child over a lifetime can cost a couple in the United States anywhere from 700,000 to $1.5 million. I mean, I think you don't, if you did a pure economic analysis, people might not have any children because of the expense and how they could enrich their own lifestyles, as opposed to
Mhm.
of course, we
Mhm.
can't just look at it in those terms.
Mhm.
So, yeah, you're absolutely right that China has assumed, I mean, in general, right now in the world, I think we're suffering from an inward movement among all people throughout the world. And China is closing itself off
Yeah.
from the rest of the world. And it's occurring everywhere. And there are costs to globalization. But globalization it was very, very important in the last 20 years in maintaining the world's prosperity. And it's because of because the jobs were going to where the costs were low.
Mhm.
And as a consequence, we benefited. We also suffered. Our
Yeah.
manufacturing
Yeah.
industries declined, but
Mhm.
yeah,
All right. Question about Germany. Net immigration in Germany is higher than in the United States.
yeah.
Is this mostly immigration from other European nations? What proportion is intra-European Union immigration?
Uh, Well, there's some proportion, but really it's been the Germans took in huge number. First of all, they've historically had large numbers of Turkish immigrants into
Mhm.
Germany. And then
Mhm.
when the Syrian debacle, which I don't think the world pays much attention to, is the number of people, 500,000 people were killed in Syria, which is a very high number, given
Yeah.
and the number of people who were dislocated is like more than a quarter of the population.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the Germans did accept a disproportionate number of Syrian immigrants, and it created the backlash, of course.
Mhm.
And everybody's closing their borders to much greater extent than they were
Mhm.
previously. So I think that
Mhm.
the answer to that question is that a lot of them were from Syria and Turkey, and you see it everywhere in Europe that and
Mhm.
it's a problem, of course, in Europe too, that there are
Mhm.
large Muslim populations in nearly every European country today.
But isn't there also isn't that one of the ground rules of the European Economic Union
Yes,
that people can very easily work across national borders?
yes,
Uh, but so does that happen? I mean, do
yes,
people,
yes. So
you know?
I should have spoken, I could have spoken a little bit more about Spain, but
Mhm.
Spain has that problem. So Spain has a very low birth rate, and because
Mhm.
it's part of the EU and the economy has been so weak for such a long time, that
Mhm.
the Spaniards are going young and bright and
Mhm.
well-educated Spaniards are leaving Spain in large numbers. So and
Mhm.
you England before it left
Mhm.
the EU was
Mhm.
receiving people from especially from Eastern Europe. You would see
Mhm.
large numbers, the Eastern European countries that were part of the Union,
Mhm.
and that's another example of this inward uh, drawing in that's occurring everywhere in the world today.
Yeah. So in Britain, presumably immigration from Poland and elsewhere has stopped now after Brexit, and yet Britain's population growth, I assume, is also low. So what are the demographic consequences of going it on their own? Is it early? Can you tell at this point, or is it
Well,
necessary to wait a while?
there are many factors that have been spoken about in terms of the English population and the English economy suffering from
Mhm.
Brexit. But I think this is another example of how it's going to suffer from Brexit.
Yeah. Mhm. All right. How has U.S. immigration policy responded to demographic economic change? How should it respond? What's the
Uh,
difference between how it has responded and how it should respond?
well, I think that we have to have controlled immigration. I mean, it's not like letting everybody in regardless, but
Hmm.
we also have to just recognize some of it is the messaging. We have to
Hmm.
recognize that we are revitalized by immigrants, and we are a nation of immigrants.
Hmm.
And net, if we manage immigration carefully, we will
Mhm.
benefit tremendously from immigration. So that message has to get out there, I think, to a much greater extent. And that does, all the particulars of how you control the borders is beyond my realm of understanding.
Mhm.
But there has to be humane and careful border protection in the United States. I think personally, I think illegal immigrants show huge initiatives to come to the United States, and oftentimes also make extraordinary contributions to the United States. So we have to have a policy where we allow them to gain citizenship at a certain point in time. But I also think that we have to I think we will be, but we have to continue to be an attractive place for high quality immigrants. And even for people, I don't want to sound elitist about this, because I think that the average immigrant, even if they are starting out at the bottom, they still, by their drive and their ambition and their desire to improve themselves, make enormous contributions to this country. This is true of all of us and the generations that preceded us. We are the products of that immigration. That's a bit, I didn't give you any particulars here.
Okay. All right. This questioner wants to know, GDP growth, gross domestic product growth in Germany is faster than in Japan, but how does that fall out when you look at GDP per capita? Is there a difference?
Yes, it is per capita, and
Oh, okay.
Germany is not like, flourishing. It's not like growing it like one of the Asian tigers once grew, or China once grew. Well, that's another important factor. I think the Chinese GDP growth today, I mean, they're saying this past year, post-COVID, it was all COVID related, and it was like maybe 4 to 5% as opposed to the 8 to 9% that we all came to expect every year. First of all, I think those statistics are inflated to begin with. They're probably off, but I think China is going to fall. It's at the same point that Japan was in 1992 because of demographic factors, and they just don't have the potential for the same kind of growth. And they need to be open to the rest of the world, because they do have all these college educated people. And they're going to have to create a consumer society that's technologically very, very advanced. And I think that the rulers in China are quite aware of this problem, and they're afraid for their own legitimacy and the stability politically, and they're clamping down on all kinds of freedoms, because they realize that the old social contract in China was, we give you prosperity and you let us rule you in an authoritarian manner. And that's breaking down, right? They're concerned that they can't maintain the prosperity, but by taking away freedoms, they're going to, it's like a bad cycle and negative cycle they're in right now.
Yeah. One way to combat population decline is immigration. The other one is, of course, to encourage the birth rate. This questioner wants to know, have any countries' strategies to increase birth rate been successful?
Yes,
Can you point to examples of a successful increase of birth
yes,
rate?
I think the Scandinavian countries have increased their birth rates right now to it's above 2.1% in most of the scan, and they've done it quite intentionally. It's not like the marriage rates are going up. I think 70% of the people who are being born in these countries are being born to partners. I mean, they're the equivalent of marriage, but they have great childcare policies, and they pay people. I mean, if you look at the way the government subsidies work in the United States, and since I'm an old guy, I don't want this to change. It's not in my self-interest to have it change, but the subsidies in the United States are going to old people. If you look at the budget of the state of Minnesota, a lot of the budget is devoted to sending checks to old folks. And you just look at the University of Minnesota, the increases in tuition, the state support for the
Yeah.
University of Minnesota is essentially, and this is true of all state institutions, state universities like the University of Minnesota, we've been privatized or deregulated. And most of our operating budgets come from tuition. We only get about 17. Last I looked, and there are different ways of calculating this, but about 70% of our budget at the University of Minnesota comes from the state. And at one time, it was essentially free to go to the University of Minnesota. So the government, as people age, are spending more and more on older people than younger people. And if that could be reversed, and families in general should be encouraged. This idea of having families, there should be, we should have a propaganda campaign.
Yeah. But since Europe in particular, and perhaps Japan as well, has long embraced a social service economy, a social support, concept, why aren't places like Italy with dramatically decreased birth rates and Japan following the Scandinavian example?
I think they've tried, but the culture and the economy, and I don't think it's just a matter of government policies that can make a difference. And so, for example, in China has reversed their one child for family policies, but people are still only having one child because it's to make a complete reversal would be very, very difficult. It becomes cultural. It becomes cultural, and it's also. I think in China, it's like taking care of the older folks is putting such a burden on young people.
Those cultural factors, do they have to do with the position of women in society? The relationships between
Yes, I think, and this is ground, but definitely in the Asian tigers in those countries. I was talking about it before. The average age of marriage is very, very high. It's in the mid-30s, and that's because women are much better educated, which is all. The more educated women are, the fewer babies they typically have, and so that's another way to solve some of the problems with the workforce, is have more women in the workforce.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, now let's turn to one of the things you mentioned early in your talk was the relationship between the age of a society, the average age of a society, and the propensity for violence. So this question wants to know, regarding the idea that a younger population can lead to more violence, do you think this is due to the testosterone factor, lack of fear of death, crowded conditions, or what?
I think all of those play a role. I'm not a expert on testosterone, but I definitely there's been a lot of work done in the United States, some of it controversial as well, but that as the population in the United States has aged, we have less crime in the United States, and violent crime has gone down in the United States. There are many reasons for it, but that's certainly one of the factors. Part of, I think, what the issue is that when you have this is something actually that that Mazar said, having grown up in Bangladesh. He said that in a society where you typically the families are very, very large, there's less parental control and social control over young people, and that young people run wild more. If you know the typical middle class family in the United States maybe has 2 children, and the way that they are trying, not always successfully, to manage the activities of their children, and is not something that can occur when you have lots and lots of children. I think that the big issue, though, is when these youth bulges reach the age of 17 to 27 or so. So when you have, and this is well known, there can be the Asian tigers, and China and Japan benefited. They had youth dividends at certain points in time, because and the key thing is having institutional structure in place, which channels that youthful energy in a positive direction. It's going to go somewhere. And if the institutions, the education, the jobs are not in place, going back to the question about China, China with all these unemployed people who graduated college in China, I think that could create enormous instability in China.
Yeah, yeah. And further, another questioner wants to know the propensity for violence in society. Is that violence, civic violence, civil violence within a society, or is there also an additional propensity to engage in war because you've got a large group of potential soldiers?
Both. I think
Both.
if you look at the what we were trying to explain, the so-called dependent variable in our earlier statistical study, it combined the two. So it looked at civil wars, it looked at civil strife, and it looked at warfare between nations. And it's very, very striking. I have a slide, but I didn't use it here. But if you look at the population in Japan right before the Second World War, it's completely inverted. It's a very, very young society. It's completely different than it is today. And so that was a national war. But if you look at these, the war in Syria, Afghanistan, in other countries that are the hotspots in the world today, many of them, until Russia, Ukraine, which surprisingly goes against my theory, but many of these, the worst violence, and it's citizen against citizen oftentimes.
What about World War II? Was there a huge, I'm sorry?
Even crime, we miss that in Latin America, because Latin America is aging, but a lot of the criminal activity which results in violence is a youth phenomenon.
Yeah, but what about World War II or World War I and II? Let's say, was there a huge European youth bulge in 1914, and then 20 years later, or 25 years later, was there a new bulge just in time for World War II? Does that track?
Yes. The simple answer is, the 19th century was we got up to 2.5 billion, but if you go back to, let's say, the year 1800, the world population was probably under 1 billion. So the 19th century was a period of, I don't know if this is true of other people in the audience, but I know my family, if I go back to great grandparents, they were all having 7 to 10 children,
Sure. Yeah. And this questioner has a kind of follow-up question. Also, she says, are demographically older countries more likely to be able to be peacemakers in wars around them or globally?
Hopefully, they can play that role, and they should be playing that role. I think that what ends the Ukraine-Russian war is that they run out of people to fight it. And the Russians have faced that problem from the beginning. The Ukrainians, it's just this incredible upsurge of national. And another example of I'm just thinking, this isn't related to the question directly, but like France right now, when Macron increased the retirement age from 60 to 62. In the United States, we think 62. It's kind of absurd but I think that's the other way to increase the workforce, is people become healthier, at least in their late 60s and early 70s, to keep them on the job is another way of dealing with this problem. But then there's the implied promises that have been made. They're not implied, they're very explicit promises have been made to older people, especially in a lot of the European countries, that they can retire at an earlier age.
This actually plays right to the next question, which is, would it be desirable for workers to stay in the workforce longer from a demographic point of view? And if so, are companies rethinking how they retain valued employees?
Yes, it's a simple answer. But I think also there are, in the beginning, and it's becoming more common, that you can, older people can find part-time work.
Mhm.
They can play a role as consultants. There can be
Mhm.
uh, policies in place in companies called phased retirement, so that it isn't it isn't a binary.
Yeah.
And people can continue. I think that's and even the uh, this is a difficult question to really get at perfectly either, because it's a balance.
Mhm.
But I mean, there's a lot of know-how that older folks have and experience that is valuable.
Mhm.
They also technologically, including myself, are, are a little bit behind on things, and are less eager to
Yeah.
adopt the most recent things.
Yeah.
But I think there's an important trade-off, and I think it's good for older people too to stay active, and
Mhm.
it gives them meaning, and actually prolongs their lives and their health.
Mhm. Mhm. All right. So, says the next questioner, should we continue to rely on other countries for the early education of our elite and not improve our own education, which is threatened by immigration right now?
Well, as I said earlier, it's not in
Is that a
myself.
true premise? Is that, are we relying on other countries' excellent education systems to provide us with our future
Well, I don't know if
leaders?
it's excellence, but there's such a winnowing of, like,
Mhm.
in India, if you get into their elite institutions, the amount of testing, it's hard to get into our elite institutions, the Ivies and the MITs of the world, if you're an
Yeah.
American. But for them to get into their elite institutions is like infinitely more difficult. So we're drawing on the best of many of those societies.
Mhm.
And but I think in an ideal world, and it's not in my self-interest to say this, but the proportion of money that we're spending on the elderly should be reduced. That will not win me many votes.
I think, given the composition of this audience, you
Of
might
this
hear some.
audience. But we really have to pay attention to young people and young families,
Mhm.
and giving them a sense of purpose and meaning, and even a sense of national meaning, that they're
Mhm.
contributing to our society by.
Mhm.
I think there's a lot of aimlessness among young people,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
this could be,
Mhm.
if we provided them with that sense of purpose, and that they
Mhm.
would be, and backed it up with actual changes in the way we spend our money, on education, on them, on families. I think that's very important.
Mhm. Um, uh, all right. Let's see. We have a few more minutes, and we do have time for a couple more questions. If there's anybody in the audience who wants to ask a question, you haven't asked it yet, you haven't heard it being asked, now's your chance. This person says, birth rates in Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Finland are all lower than in the United States. Is that true? I thought
I,
you said these countries were increasing their birth rate.
Sweden and Norway and Denmark have been doing much better. I don't.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that they have seen a turnaround. That's
Mm-hmm.
my understanding of. I haven't looked, precisely. So, and any of us could easily get this data, but that's my
Mm-hmm.
understanding, that they have experienced a turnaround,
Okay.
which does
Okay.
show that it's possible. The Asian tigers, even though they've tried to in China, they have not seen this turnaround.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, while we're giving people a chance maybe to ask another question, I'm going to ask about the interrelationship between demographic change and the specific future of American politics. Already we see this sort of, what shall I say, migration. The Republican Party is becoming a party of older whiter people. Um, Given our demographic rate of change, our demographics, is this likely to prevail? What's going to be the relationship
Well,
there?
I think there's two countervailing trends going on, because I think that in general, young people are more progressive than older
Mhm.
people, and you do have among the more populist elements and
Mhm.
anti-immigrant elements, they tend to be older and whiter. But you also, there's another trend that goes on that I think the putting off of having children is much greater among people, young people who are progressive.
Mhm.
So the family formation is probably, and it is much greater among family types that would be more conservative politically.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
how this plays out in the long run, I
That's
think
interesting.
really, I mean,
Uh-huh.
I think we really have to think about these issues very, very carefully. I mean, I think that would be
Yeah.
my conclusion, is that it affects our economy in major ways. It affects our standing in the world
Mhm.
in major ways. And that we have not devoted enough attention to it. And we have to, um, we have to encourage both immigration. We have to encourage family formation.
Yeah.
And we have to spend more on our young people so that they have a sense of hope.
Mhm. All right, now here's a question that speaks right to today's headlines, really.
Yeah.
Didn't the Minnesota legislature favor kids in its current budget, which just passed this week, favor kids over seniors by not giving a tax break on Social Security to those making more than $100,000 a year? Do you want to
Yes.
comment on that?
I mean, Social Security in and of itself is not a progressive form of taxation, as we all know,
Mm-hmm,
because for many reasons. I mean, it's capped at a certain
mm-hmm,
point, and the redistribution that occurs is based on your lifetime earnings. So
mm-hmm.
as a consequence, sometimes I feel like I don't deserve that check, and somebody else would do much better with that check
Yeah.
than myself.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
yeah, I agree.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we are just about out of time. So I want to thank you very much, Professor Alfred Marcus. I want to thank especially the people behind the scenes, Carmi Blyfus, who's not here today, but Grayson Simmons, who very much is. And thank you so much to the audience for such excellent questions. I hope everyone will come back next week when we will welcome Professor Deborah Appelman from Carlton, who will speak on culture wars in the classroom. So come
Okay.
and join us then. But for
Good,
right now, thank you very
good
much.
follow-up.
And we'll
Thank you
say
very
goodbye.
much for the opportunity to do this.
Thank you all.